Chapter 5 The Carnival. The school year finally came to a close, and the girls were happy they would be able to enjoy their summer. Anna had kept to herself for the rest of the school year. Richie would give her dirty looks every so often, but he never said a word to her otherwise. He was even angry at her now, as all the kids made fun of him for getting beat up by a girl. Marie had successfully passed her exams and was accepted to the town's high school. She was one of the few girls that would be going. Anna skipped on her way home from school on the last day, then ran as she approached their block. Marie followed behind her with hurried footsteps, but kept her stance more ladylike. When they got home, Anna sped up the stairs and threw her school books onto her bedroom floor and pushed them under her bed. Ah, freedom, she thought as she sighed contentedly. She opened her bedroom window and inhaled the warm summer breeze. Marie, meanwhile, retrieved Thomas from their neighbor, Mrs. Russell, who was watching him today. "Does this mean I get to stay home for the rest of the summer now?" he asked as he bounced next to Marie. "Sure does," she replied. "We get to play with you all summer." "But you're not going to give me cookies like Mrs. Russell," he muttered. Marie sighed. "You can't live off cookies, Tommy." When Edward returned home from work, Marie showed him her final report card and an acceptance letter. He beamed with pride and enveloped his daughter in a warm hug. "Well, I guess this calls for a celebration." "The carnival?" Thomas cheered. "That's right. Next weekend it opens." Edward, the children, and Alicia walked up to the large field where the carnival was being held. Thomas had begged his father to let Alicia come. He started to favor her after she sang to him, and he looked forward to seeing her every chance he could get. Alicia herself was secretly excited about going to a carnival, having never been to one. At least it was something different for a change. Edward, for his part, didn't mind having the woman's company. A large red and white sign welcomed them at the entrance to the carnival. The midway was bustling with townspeople excited for a day out. The smells of the various food stands filled the air. The salty aroma of roasted peanuts, the sweet scent of cotton candy, and the buttery fragrance of popcorn. Dispersed throughout the midway were different games to play and win a prize. The sound of various mechanical instruments could be heard above the cacophony of voices. Thomas's eyes were going in 5 different directions at once. He kept trying to run to several different attractions, with his father having to keep pulling him back. "Carousel!" he yelled, spotting the ride. "I want to go on the carousel." "All right, calm down," Edward ordered as the boy pulled him over to it. He took his turn on the ride as both of his sisters decided to sit out. Edward watched as his son passed by, waving his hand and smiling widely. He noticed Alicia watching out of the corner of his eye. She seemed completely enthralled with the mechanics of the ride, her eyes constantly looking up at the machinery under the carousel housing. He was amused at her wonder, knowing that such inventions were all new to her. When the ride finally finished, Thomas hopped off and the family moved on. A fairground organ that stood near the center of the midway caught Alicia's attention, and she walked closer to get a better look. In the middle of the organ was the small figure of a conductor who moved his baton in time with the music. Beside him were 2 statues of women who held small bells in their hands that also moved with the music. The organ pipes played vigorously as the snare drums and cymbals kept the beat. The outer edges of the large instrument had paintings of various flowers that were bordered by wooden swirls painted in gold and white. "Do you want to see how it works?" the operator of the organ asked. "Yes, I would," she nodded. He moved around the back of the organ and pointed to a long sheet that was feeding into the machine. "That's the book music," he explained. "The holes in the sheet determine which note gets played." He explained more parts of the organ, and Alicia listened intently, utterly fascinated by the instrument. "Thank you for showing me," she said as he finished. Then she walked back to Edward and the children. "It's incredible that a machine can do all of that." "I can only imagine all the work that goes into making them," Edward agreed. They walked down the line of red and white striped booths. At the game booths, the attendants were calling out to people to come and play. The games include a ring toss, a rifle target shooting stall, and a baseball toss. Thomas stopped at the baseball one and pointed to a stuffed brown bear on the shelf. "I want that one," he cried out. "Go ahead, son," the game attendant cheered. "Give it a try." "Can I, Pa?" He looked up at his father. "Sure, why not?" "3 balls for a nickel," the attendant stated. Edward handed the man a nickel, and the attendant handed Thomas a ball. The baseball seemed too big for his hand, and he awkwardly threw it overhand. The ball went at an angle and landed past the wooden bucket. Try throwing it like this. Edward mimicked an underhand throw, and not as hard. Thomas nodded and tried again. The throw was a bit too soft, and it landed in front of the bucket and bounced away. Do you want me to try? Edward bent down toward Thomas. He nodded reluctantly, and his father took the last ball. Edward eyed the bucket for a moment before pitching the ball. It landed in the bucket and bounced, but stayed in. Thomas let out a hearty cheer, and Edward pointed to the stuffed bear. Here you go, son. Take care of him now, Attendant warned as he handed the boy the bear. Thomas squealed with delight as he hugged the bear to his chest. Thanks, Pa. Any time, Edward smiled as he ruffled his son's hair. I'm just glad I managed to get it in. Further down the midway, there was an opening between some of the stalls and a path that led to a small Ferris wheel. It stood several feet behind the booths, and there was already a line of people waiting to go on. Thomas stopped to look up at it. That's like the other one, he exclaimed. Want to go on with me? Anna asked. He suddenly looked shy. I don't know, he said. It looks pretty tall. The one on the boardwalk is taller. I've been on that one and it's not so scary, she assured him. She held out her hand and he took it as she led him to the ride. Alicia noticed Marie standing back and not going with her siblings. Aren't you going to join them? She asked. No, I feel like I'm getting too old for that, she said, looking down. Will you come with me to get some food, though? Of course, Alicia nodded. Edward followed his two youngest children, and Alicia accompanied Marie to the food stands. Marie was silent for most of the walk over to the food area. The two women walked up to one of the red and white striped booths. Marie decided to get some popcorn while Alicia bought a large puffy cone of pink fairy floss. Marie took a patch of the cotton candy and let Alicia try some of the popcorn. The older woman decided she wasn't a fan, feeling the kernels getting stuck in her teeth. Marie went for another handful of popcorn when she suddenly stopped. She groaned and clutched her lower abdomen. What's wrong? Alicia asked, concerned. I don't know. Marie's face contorted in pain. I thought I was just feeling hunger pains, but now I think it's, well... Her face turned red with embarrassment. What is it? Alicia pressed her. I think it's the woman's problem, Marie answered quietly. I've never had it before, but I noticed a little bit of blood yesterday night. Oh, you poor thing. Alicia empathized with the girl, whose face grew redder. She herself had begun to experience the monthly torture now that she was human. I can't talk to my father about it, she spoke in a low voice. It's too embarrassing. I don't know what to do. I can tell him if you want. Don't worry, I'll be discreet about it, Alicia added as she wrapped her arm around the younger girl's shoulders. And I'll share my advice. Alicia gave her some tips, while the two walked back to the Ferris wheel. Edward walked toward the women, with Anna and Thomas following. Thomas was bouncing up and down as he made his way to Alicia. That was so much fun. You should try it, he cried with delight. Maybe another time. Alicia laughed at the little boy's amusement. The group continued to walk on through the crowded carnival. They passed more food and game stands. Thomas noticed a strength game and begged his father to take a turn. Please, he pleaded as he tugged on the older man's arm. All right, Edward hushed him. He walked up to the machine and placed a penny in the coin slot. He clutched the handle with his right hand and the ball reached up to the second highest level. That's good, Pa. Thomas then turned to Alicia. You try. Why don't you try it? She asked him. Ladies first. He smiled up at her. Oh, what a charming little gentleman. She smiled down at the boy. His mood was infectious. She gripped the handle and pressed as hard as she could. The bell shot up to the third highest level. That's right under me. Have you been weightlifting? Edward teased her. Maybe, she smirked. My turn. Thomas moved past them to the machine. Edward had to hold him up so he could even reach the handle. The bell barely got up to the second highest level. Aw, I'm weak, he griped. Edward placed him back on the ground. He'll get stronger as you get older. Edward patted the boy's head, and the group continued to move on. Toward the end of the midway, there was a row of large banners. The colorful posters had several images of different performers. They advertised a sideshow that included sword swallowers and freaks. Both Anna and Thomas wanted to go see it, even though Edward was a bit reluctant. They paid the cost for the tickets to the show and entered the tent. Once the tent was relatively filled, the performance began. A man in a bright blue velvet tailcoat and black top appeared from behind a curtain on the small stage. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, he shouted. We have some of the most curious oddities in human history for you to witness. But I must warn you, make no sudden movements. Make no loud noises. If you frighten these freaks, there's no telling what they'll do. Now, I ask you all to turn your full attention to Sano. Watch as he eats and dances with fire and never once gets burned. A man in a colorful vest appeared on stage. He had a sort of wand with him, which he dipped into a pot of liquid and then set alight with a match. He waved the wand around in front of the audience before he rolled the wand up his arm, showing the crowd how the flames danced on his flesh. After extinguishing his arm, he then held the torch up to his mouth and blew a spray of liquid which caught fire in a dramatic cloud. He grabbed a second one to ignite and danced around with both before one by one extinguishing the two wands in his mouth, seemingly without harm. The crowd was awed and cheered him on. "Such a great man," the master of ceremonies announced. "Next, feast your eyes on the fearsome, dangerous darlings, but be careful not to cross their path." A group of 3 women walked out onto the stage. They were scantily clad in sleeveless, tight-fitting, corset-like shirts, with puffy, ruffled shorts to match. One held a rose in her mouth, while another broke it by cracking a whip against it. Then one of their members stood against a board, while the other 2 threw daggers at it. This received applause from the audience, who had been sitting on the edge of their seats. Some of the single men in the audience whistled and cheered. Edward turned to Alicia at this, clearly uncomfortable with the younger children here. She just shrugged her shoulders, hoping the show wouldn't get more risque. "Such a generous group of ladies showing us their talents," the announcer called as the women bowed and walked off the stage. "Now, hold your breaths for the next performer, our resident sword swallower, Davy the Brave." A man walked out carrying a black rolled-up cloth with him. He laid the cloth on the table and unrolled it to reveal several different-sized sharp objects. The man took out a dagger and showed it to everyone before tilting his head back and slowly inserting it into his throat. He did this with the different daggers and swords until he eventually reached the largest sword in his collection. Several people in the audience were cringing and gasping and giving relieved sighs once the swords were pulled out of his mouth. "I never understood why anyone would want to do that," Alicia muttered to Edward. "Why take the risk? Death wish, I suppose," he shrugged. "Or maybe they just like the thrill of it." Once that act was complete, the announcer stepped back on the stage. "Now that our human death machines are done, I implore you all to witness the greatest human oddities you will ever see. First, the world's smallest man." A tiny man, perhaps just making it past 3 feet tall, emerged on the stage. He wore a small tuxedo and bowed several times before the audience. One by one, more freaks were announced as they came on stage. A strong man followed and lifted an audience member in their chair. Then came another man who walked out on his arms as he had no legs. He was followed by a woman with extensive facial hair whom they called the Wolf Girl. Alicia felt unnerved watching this, especially as the crowd gawked and laughed. "Why do they subject these people to this kind of humiliation?" she groused. "I'm sure most of them choose to do it, and they're receiving an income," Edward said to her. "Besides, this is probably one of the only places they'd be accepted. Their families might not even accept them." Her lips formed a thin line as she turned her attention back to the show. 4 years ago, she could have been the one up on that stage. The feathered lady, they would have called her. People would have gawked at the feathers that dotted her limbs. Her stomach twisted at the thought. Once the performance came to an end, the audience filed out of the tent. Thomas walked a few feet ahead of his family, looking around for what else the carnival had to offer. He spotted a hall of mirrors and ran toward it. Edward told his daughters to go with him and to keep him close by. They did as they were told and entered the building with their brother. Thomas walked up to the first mirror and looked at his reflection. He giggled at the distorted image and his sisters followed suit. Marie looked into one that made her wider and Anna one that made her taller. Thomas continued to walk ahead and reached a section of the attraction that was completely deserted of other visitors. The mirrors formed a circle, and it was hard to tell which one was an opening to another hallway. He looked up at the reflection, giggling at his body made wavy. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Turning to the mirror on his left, he was startled to see a clown reflected in the corner of the mirror. The clown was dressed in a black and white striped costume. His painted face looked like it was done in a hurry, with streaks of white grease paint and missing patches here and there. The red lips were smeared on and were unsmiling and threatening. The eyes were almost black and held no light. Thomas gasped and turned but saw no one behind him. The clown was still reflected in the mirrors, but he couldn't tell where he was. The boy jumped when he felt someone grab his sides. "What's the matter?" Anna asked as she came up behind him and playfully grasped her younger sibling. "Your reflection scare you?" No, he said, finding it hard to speak. Tommy, what's wrong? Marie came up to them and noticed how pale her brother's face was. Nothing, he murmured, just dizzy. Looks like the mirrors aren't agreeing with you. Let's go. Marie took his hand and led the three of them through the remainder of the mirror maze. Once outside, the children rejoined their father and Alicia. Ready to go? Edward asked. The children nodded and began to walk back to the carnival's entrance. Looking back at the hall of mirrors, Thomas spotted a figure standing near the exit. It was the clown. His pointy hat sat at a crooked angle and his floppy collar looked disheveled. His shoes were dirty with fresh mud. His smile was menacing and seemed to hide something sinister. He waved his hand at Thomas. The boy was struck with fear at the sight and refused to move. Alicia noticed this and gently tugged at his hand. What's the matter, Tommy? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, then pointed his finger in the direction of the hall of mirrors. There was a clown over there, he answered. Alicia looked toward the spot where he pointed, but she didn't see a clown. It was probably just one of the carnival workers, sweetie. She tried to reassure the boy. Although, come to think of it, she didn't remember seeing any clowns at the carnival earlier. Tugging at his hand again, she was able to get him to move. The group made their way back to the center of town. Alicia bade goodbye to the family and thanked them for inviting her. She walked in the opposite direction of the family back to the boarding house. She could have sworn she heard footsteps not far behind her and turned around. She spotted an elderly woman walking down her front steps and assumed it was her, so she continued walking on. Still, she had an odd feeling something was amiss, but couldn't quite place it. Meanwhile, Edward and the children made their way back to their house. Thomas's mood had lightened since leaving, but he kept looking over his shoulder. That was the most fun I ever had, he exclaimed. Good. I'm glad you had fun. Edward smiled at his son as he opened the front door. What about you girls? He asked his daughters. I really like the sideshow, Anna responded. Can you believe that man actually put fire in his mouth? I believe it does take a certain level of insanity, Edward added. He was glad the children could forget about the grief caused by their mother's death for a few hours. However, he noticed Marie had taken to sitting hunched over on the couch. She was rubbing her stomach. Alicia told him about her current predicament when they were alone. He decided not to mention anything about it so as to save her from embarrassment. I'll get you a warm cloth, he said. That should help. Marie just nodded, thankful he didn't say anything more. Thomas got into bed that night and held his new stuffed bear close. His eyelids felt heavy as he drifted off to sleep. A tap against his window stirred him from his slumber. At first he didn't think anything of it, but then he heard another, louder ping. He groggily got out of bed and walked over to the window. He climbed on top of his toy chest to get a better look and pulled back the curtains. His heart stopped at the sight that met him. Standing in the middle of the darkened alleyway between his house and the neighbor's was the clown. He waved at Thomas before beckoning him to come outside. Thomas screamed and ran to the door that connected his room to his father's. Pa! Pa! He yelled as he pounded on the door. Edward was startled as the cries woke him. He rushed to his son's room. What's wrong? He asked, his voice ragged. The clown! He's here! Thomas choked out as his face turned red and tears fell down his face. What? Edward had no idea what he was talking about. He's outside! The boy yelled as he pointed to the window. Edward rushed over to the window but saw no one. I don't see anyone, Edward said, turning back to his son. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? No, I wasn't dreaming, the boy cried out in frustration. He was there. What's going on? Edward turned to see Marie standing in the door with Anna behind her. They had been awoken by the commotion. Your brother swears he saw a clown out his window, Edward replied, as he moved over to the other window at the front of the room. Edward didn't see anyone in front of the house either. Stay here and calm your brother down, he told Marie as he went downstairs. He opened the front door and walked around to the side of the house, but didn't see anyone. He walked back into the house, locking the door behind him. He went into the kitchen and looked out the back door again. There was no one. He walked back upstairs to his son's room. He said he saw the same clown at the carnival today, Anna said. I think you're just afraid of clowns, son, Edward explained, looking at the boy. You probably had a nightmare. But I didn't. He was real, Thomas pleaded with his father. All right. Edward nodded as he smoothed his son's hair. He wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. He hadn't seen anyone, and he didn't remember seeing any clowns at the carnival. Can I stay with you tonight? Thomas asked. Yes, if it will make you feel better, Edward answered as the young boy vigorously nodded. Both girls went back to bed as Thomas followed his father. He curled up next to him on the bed, clutching his bear tightly to his chest.